Good morning again, church family. Before we begin our journey through the book of Daniel, I want to just take a couple moments and touch on what we spoke about last week in a message called Growing Together in Love. Brought up a question that I asked myself and all of us the very first Sunday that we were here. That question, I'm going to repeat it again this morning. What is our why? What is our why? Well, we talked about how Jesus actually gives us our why, the reason that we do the things that we do, the motivation behind how we live our life and how we approach the world. He actually gives us, both as individual believers and as a church family, within His Word, He gives us the answer to that question, why? Why are we here? Why am I here personally? Why are we here in this place together at this time? We saw in Matthew 22 what Jesus said. Somebody asked Him, what's the most important thing? And this is how He answered. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Again, we talked about, loving God with everything we've got. Loving people who are created in God's image. That's what we've got to be about. That's what our why has to be. Individually, as Christ followers, and as the Grace Baptist Church family. We better be about what Jesus says is most important, right? Followers of Jesus Christ love. And we are meant to grow in that love. Not to stay the same. We're meant to grow. Gave us all some homework to do. I'm big on that. I'm a biblical counseling guy. We always give homework to people because some stuff can happen in the time that we get to spend together, but you know what? There's a lot of other time during the week. So I pray that you took the opportunity to do that. Again, challenged you to ask yourself a question and to really pray through that question and to let God lead you into an answer for that question. I did the homework this week. Yay, I'm the apple shiner of the group, right? But I pray that you did. The question was this: God, how are you going to use me for the building up of this Grace Baptist Church family? Where do I fit in? What is my role? What am I responsible to do? What's my passion? What are my gifts? And God, how do those fit into the why that your Son gave us? Where we're to love you with all we've got and to love other people like we love ourselves. How can you use what I have to do that? What are you calling me to do? And God, can you help me get there and do it? Why, I challenge you all to not only ask yourself that question, but if you came up with an answer this week, I challenge you to share it with somebody. I hope that you've done that. If you haven't yet, it's not too late. I will tell you, I had a gentleman share his answer with me right after service last week. And he said, I'm supposed to be working with children in children's ministry. And I said, yeah, you're exactly right. I see that in you too. And so again, I pray that you've asked yourself that question. Because again, what we talked about last week, we can come together for something to do, or we can come together to do something, right? God calls us to do something for Him and His kingdom, to love Him more and to love others more. Why? Because they're made in His image, right? And that's loving each other within this church family and loving people who are a part of this community that aren't a part of any church family, right? So again, what is God calling you to do? How are you called to serve? to sacrifice, to give, because that's how God defines love, right? We talked about that as well. Again, I'm not going to give you guys homework and not do it myself. So I want to share with you my answer. God, how are you going to use me for the building up of the Grace Baptist Church family? I believe God has called me to the ministry of His Word and to prayer. And I also believe He's called me to equip the saints for the ministry. That's what I'm called to do and focus on here. And I want to be about that business. Again, I challenge you, if you haven't had a chance to answer that question, maybe you haven't heard that message, go on to YouTube, look up Grace Baptist Washington. You can watch that message. I want you to really be considering that. Because a lot of times we can come into church, hear a message, be fired up about it, and walk out, and almost immediately the excitement starts to wane, doesn't it? And then it's like we find ourselves on Wednesday, and it's like, oh man, I forgot what we were even talking about. We want to be a church family that hears the Word and puts it into practice. So if God is dealing with us through His Word, we want to be people who put it into practice. So again, challenge you with that. Now, we're starting a new sermon series today, going to shift gears on the book of Daniel, and it's kind of the name for the series that kind of embodies what I think we're really going to focus on is this: Daniel going against the culture's current. And I want to start off the message this morning with just an illustration of a personal story. Okay, so I like to do audience participation. If you've been around here, you know that. So I got a question. How many of you in the house this morning have ever been in a river? Actually in the river. Either wading in it or swimming in it. Maybe you were in a boat in the river. So a lot of you have. Some of you have not. In one form or another, though, that's what I was asking. Have you ever been in a river? And we live in Maysville, so we live pretty close to the White River, and we live close to a boat ramp to get in the White River. A few years ago, for Father's Day, Nicole and the boys got me a kayak for Father's Day. Well, I'd never been kayaking before, but it looked fun, so I wanted to try it out. And again, we live close to the White River, so I thought, hey, you know what? I'll throw it up on top of the Jeep, drive down the White River, we'll pop in and see how it goes, right? So I went down there and I found out that the river was up a little more than normal. And I could tell there was definitely a current in it by looking at it. You know, you could kind of see stuff moving from right to left, you know. And but I was like, man, it's not that big a deal. It's nothing I can't handle, right? Well, looks can be deceiving, friends. Come to find that out, I put on my life jacket, Nicole. I did wear a life jacket. And I got into the kayak, snapped my paddle together, and then launched myself off the boat ramp, right? First time, okay? And it was at this instant that a thought entered my head, also for the first time. And that thought was, you know, Tony, it may have been wise to take this kayak out on a pond or a lake or something prior to going out into the river. I wish I would have thought of that just an instant before. Because within about 5 seconds of leaving the boat ramp, the river's current, which I will tell you was much stronger than it looked like, it took me straight towards this big pile of rocks that was right off of the shore. And I mean, I'm beelining it right towards these things, not where I wanted to be. So in a panic, I just start flailing my arms, not knowing what I'm doing, right? Trying to paddle myself in a better direction. And I'm happy to say, by the grace of God, I was able to successfully evade the pile of rocks. And immediately, I started trying to make my way to the middle of the river, because I was like, there aren't piles of rocks in the middle of the river, so I'm going to go that way. And I was doing it. I was kayaking. It's like, okay, settling myself down, kind of gathering myself, and I passed under the Highway 50 bridge there, if you know where it crosses the White River. And again, I had one of those thoughts that occurred to me not until that very moment. And it was, Tony, the boat ramp is way back there upstream. And that's where your Jeep is parked. What's the plan for the end of this trip, self? How do you plan on getting your kayak back to the Jeep? Well, again, I'm ashamed to say I didn't have a very good answer for that at the time. I hadn't made a plan. And I was being carried away by the river's current. Again, like I said, it was a lot stronger than what it first looked like to me. Well, I am happy to tell you I was able to get my bearings and do some really hard paddling and to get safely back to the boat ramp a little while later. But again, the strength of the current has been something that's stuck in my mind ever since. The power of that current, it fooled me. It surprised me. It was a force to be reckoned with. And I would have never known it just looking at it, right? Now I can tell you, as a little bit more experienced kayaker, I respect the power of the current. I like to have Gabe drop me off upstream so I can float down to the boat ramp. Again, don't fear the current, but I do respect it. And I share this story with you because I want us to get kind of thinking in the same direction. We all live in a world, in a society, in a culture that has a definite current to it, don't we? Very much like a river. And day in and day out, we find ourselves in the midst of our culture's river, so to speak, right? And guys, that river is always heading in a particular direction, isn't it? The current of this world attempts to take us away from God, doesn't it? Not towards Him. Have you noticed that? Surely you have. It attempts to move us, to direct us, and to overpower us. And if we are not prepared, and we just give ourselves over to the world's current, guys, it's going to take us someplace where we, as people who love God, a place that we don't want to go. Romans 12:2 warns us about the world and about this current. It says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and prove what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. We hear another warning in 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17. It says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires. But whoever does the will of God abides forever. So this morning, on the cusp of this new sermon series, I just want to say, as followers of Christ, if that describes you, if you are a Christian, we are told not to conform to the pattern of this world, not to just go with the flow, so to speak, and allow the world's current to take us where it will. As people of God, we are called actually to be nonconformists, countercultural. We're called to swim against the current of the world. And guys, I can tell you, it's never been easy. It never will be. But it's always been that way for people who love God. And we have a choice. We can either be a conformer or be a transformer. Are we going to conform to the world, Or are we going to be transformed by the renewing of our minds, by a deep and intimate relationship with our Lord and Savior? Now, all those things being said, enter the book of Daniel. Okay? Daniel had the courage to be a transformer. He went against the current of the culture in which he found himself. And over the course of the next couple of months, we're going to walk through the whole book of Daniel, because within it, we're going to see some really great examples and get some awesome encouragement. We see people who show us that just because we live as foreigners and sojourners in this world doesn't mean that we have to conform to the pattern of this world. We don't have to settle for giving up ourselves to the current of our culture. The faithfulness of Daniel and his friends is going to be, like I said, a big encouragement to us. This is one of my favorite books in the Old Testament. One of my favorite Bible books, period. There's just so much in it, and it's so rich. And Daniel and his friends, we're going to see these men were in the minority. And I have news for you, friends. If you want to live a life that follows God, where you love Him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you're learning to love other people as you love yourself, guess what? If you want that, you too are in the minority, my friends. You're going to be swimming upstream in this world. Being in the minority is hard. Swimming upstream is exhausting. But Daniel did it. And we have God's inspired and sufficient word showing us how He did it. And therefore how we can do it, right? By being dependent on Him. So I want to start with some important background information. And again, from time constraints, I got to apologize on the front end. We're going to go through roughly 3,000 years of history in about 2 minutes, okay? But it's important, before we get into this book, to kind of give some context of where we are in the Bible, okay? And where Daniel lays and what has happened, so that we know the context of what we're going to be reading. So when we come to the book of Daniel in our Bibles, we've got to understand a lot of things that have already taken place. Maybe, has anybody out there committed to a Bible plan for this year? I hope that you have. I see some hands going up. That's good. Okay. If your plan includes the Old Testament, it's very likely in the past week you've read about Abraham, right? Abraham was a man chosen by God, and God promised him that he would make a great nation from his offspring. And God did exactly what He promised. He made the Hebrew people. And as we fast forward to Exodus, we see that the Hebrew people were enslaved for over 400 years in Egypt until God released them from their bondage and eventually took them to the land that He had promised Abraham and his descendants. And after coming into the promised land, God's people Israel kind of went back and forth. Not kind of, they did. They went back and forth from being faithful somewhat to God to just being outright unfaithful to Him. They flip-flop over and over again. All the while, God remained faithful and true to them and to His covenant with them. Now, eventually, the people of Israel become a nation, and that nation was meant to model to the rest of the world just how wonderful a relationship with God could be. But the people of Israel continued to oscillate back and forth over and over again, from following God to turning away from Him. In His mercy, God sends prophets, people with His word on their lips, repeating what God has said and revealed, to warn the people to repent and to turn from their unfaithfulness to Him. God even warned them that if they did not turn from their idolatry, that He would use foreign kingdoms to take over Israel as a means of disciplining them and returning their hearts to Him. So, Again, a lot of history in just a couple minutes. By the time we get to the book of Daniel, the nation of Israel had already for some time been divided into a northern kingdom called Israel, the northern 10 tribes, and then a southern kingdom called Judah. Okay? And the northern kingdom had already been under foreign control for about 100 years by the time we get to Daniel 1. Then the last remnant of the once great nation of Israel, Judah, that southern kingdom, it had given itself over to idolatry as well, worshiping and chasing after false gods, all the while trying to throw God a bone and act like they were faithful to Him, but their hearts were far from Him. And God, being true to His word and to His warning, gave Judah into the hands of a foreign empire, the Babylonian Empire, and its leader, King Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, so now that we have some background, again, I want to read the first 2 verses of Daniel chapter 1. So it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God." First thing I want you to notice in verse 2, where it says, "The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand." One theme that we're going to see as we study the book of Daniel is the sovereignty of God. We talked about it in our Sunday school class a lot this morning, in our basic training class. The sovereignty of God. God gave Nebuchadnezzar Judah. He gave Judah over to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Now, to give you an idea, that I don't assume that everybody in the room knows this, so if you do already know it, bear with me. But Babylon was a pagan nation, okay? They worshipped multiple false gods, or what you've heard me probably talk to about as little g, lowercase gods, not real gods. Now, even though that was true about Babylon, the one true God used this pagan empire to discipline His people, Israel, in an effort to bring their hearts back to Him. Nebuchadnezzar, the mighty king of Babylon, ruler of the known world at that time, he thought he was in charge, right? But he wasn't actually in charge. We're going to see, as we go into the book of Daniel, how Nebuchadnezzar even comes to realize that for himself. The only reason he had successfully invaded Judah is because sovereign God allowed him to. God gave Judah into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. It was all part of the plan from before the beginning. Nebuchadnezzar may have ruled, but the God of Israel overruled his rule. Do you see that? He used this pagan king and nation to fulfill his preordained divine purposes. Again, we're going to be seeing a lot of the sovereignty of God in this book. That's one of the reasons I love it so much. So, let's look again at verses 3 and 4. It says, "Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans." So, in these verses, we see part of Nebuchadnezzar's long-term plan for his empire. And we talked about it again in our Sunday school class. Part of the plan was assimilation. He takes some of Israel's best and brightest, some of the youths, the cream of the crop, the guys that are the best looking, the natural-born leaders, the ones that were intelligent and strong, witty, the the people who had it all together. And he said, I'm going to take the best they've got, and I'm going to reprogram them to serve my purposes. Again, to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Chaldeans, another word for Babylonians, okay? Nebuchadnezzar's plan was to place these youths into the current of the Babylonian culture, okay? He wants to get them into that current. It's like, okay, this is where I want these guys to go. They're obviously smart, gifted. I want them to have allegiance to me and to my purposes. I'm going to put them in the midst of our culture. I'm going to saturate them with it. And then they're going to float right down the current to where I want them to be. We're going to teach you to talk like we talk. We're going to teach you to think like we think. And it doesn't stop there. Look at verses 5 through 7. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. Now, we get to this point. Not only is Nebuchadnezzar trying to assimilate these youths and get them flowing in the current of the Babylonian culture, so to speak, he actually has a goal of giving them a whole new identity. Names in the Bible are important. They reflect something. Often they reflect the character of a person, or maybe the purpose that God has for them in this world. And you take away somebody's name, that's a big deal. Nebuchadnezzar wants really to erase who these youths were and then teach them to be somebody else. Now, I want to give just one example. Daniel, a name that most of you are familiar with. Daniel's name in Hebrew means God is my judge. Again, talking about the one true God. The new name Nebuchadnezzar wants to give to Daniel, Belteshazzar, means something incredibly different. It means Prince of Bel, or under the protection of Bel. Or maybe you've heard him called Baal, a false god that we see throughout the Old Testament. Again, a Babylonian god of order and destiny. So imagine, just for a minute, we got to do this when we read the Bible. Try to put yourself in Daniel's place, or into Mishael's place, or Azariah, any of the guys. Put yourself into their place. Imagine getting robbed of your beautiful name that was reflective of your identity in your faith in God. A name that glorified the God of Israel. And you're given a name instead that's meant to honor a false god. I've told you guys this before. We named our boys Gabriel on purpose. That means man of God. Emmanuel, on purpose we named him that. God with us. It'd be like us taking those names away from him and saying, Gabe, your new name's Satan's helper. Imagine what that would be like. And that's what everybody called you from then on. Think about what that must have been like for Daniel and for those boys. It must have been heartbreaking. Let's continue verses 8 through 10. Listen to what Daniel does. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of eunuchs. And the chief of eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink, for why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. So we come to a place in this passage where Daniel draws a line, right? He's like, okay, here's the line. This is a line that cannot be crossed. You make me learn your customs. You can make me read your books. You can give me a new language. You can even give me a new name. But what you can't do is you cannot change my faith in my God. I will not be robbed of that. You see, eating from the king's table, that had some pretty big ramifications. That would have meant that Daniel and his friends would have been breaking the law of Moses. There were dietary laws. When God set apart his people Israel, gave them this law and said, you're going to be set apart. You're going to be an example to the rest of the world. And for that reason, since I'm making you holy, there are certain things that you're going to do and not do. And part of that were these dietary laws. And if Daniel and his friends would have eaten from the king's table, guess what? They would have been in violation of those laws. And they hadn't violated those laws their whole lives. Again, Daniel's like, okay, I can't do that. So he asks the guy in charge. He's not a jerk about it. I like that example of Daniel too. He asks the guy that is in charge of him, the chief of the eunuchs, permission not to defile himself. And look at verse 9. There's that phrase again. And God gave. Sovereignty of God. Look for that phrase as you read the book of Daniel. God gave. God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. We still have a problem, don't we? Even though the chief of the eunuchs had favor and compassion for Daniel, he was a little more favorable and compassionate to his own neck, right? And we see that. He tells Daniel essentially, if you Hebrew guys only eat vegetables and drink water, you're going to end up looking worse than everybody else, all the other young people from the other countries. And Nebuchadnezzar is going to point at me, and he's going to ask me, how come I let you guys get in this shape? And he's going to say, off with his head, right? So, again, sovereign God. How's he going to deal with this problem? Let's look at verses 11 through 16. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you. And deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this manner and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. So here we see Daniel goes to the steward, the man that the chief of the eunuchs said, hey, this is what's going on. You need to be in charge of these guys, right? Daniel goes to him and asks him for a 10-day trial run, right? Steward, we got 3 years before we appear in front of the king. Let's just do a test. You let the other youths eat from the king's table. Let them drink the wine, eat the food. We don't want to do that because that would defile us. That would cause us to compromise our convictions and our faith in our God. Instead, just for 10 days, let us have vegetables, water. And after 10 days, if we look worse than they do, then you know what? Bring on the king's food. But, if we do look worse, at least we got the rest of the 3 years for us to get fattened up again, right? So Daniel's being smart. Daniel's being kind, right? He's not demanding. Well, what happens? At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his friends were, quote, better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. Fatter in flesh, that just means, guys, they looked good, okay? Noticeably better, healthier, stronger than the others youths. So the steward is like, I guess we'll let you Hebrew guys eat what you want then. Because look at how amazing you look. Now, Don't overlook this, guys. This is a miracle. How many of you eat vegetables and drink water and actually gain weight and muscle mass? Not very many, right? This is a miracle that takes place. It's not some fad diet. Don't go off and get on the Daniel diet and think, well, at least not for this reason. Sovereign God blesses the faithfulness of Daniel and his friends, and not just with the way they look. Let's keep reading. Verse 17. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them. And among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. After 3 years, the Babylonians spent that 3 years trying to take away everything from Daniel and their boys, their home, their customs, their names. But they failed to take away their identity, didn't they? They did not assimilate. They did not conform into new little Babylonians. No, they transformed, actually. They transformed into the best versions of themselves. Again, the cream of the crop, 10 times better than all the rest of the wise men. Why? How are they able to do that? Because they kept their faith in God. These men did not allow the current of the culture in which they found themselves to dictate where they were going to go, right? They actually went against the culture's current. They swam upstream. They had the faith in God to go against it. They had been brought low, taken from their homeland, robbed of their families, robbed of their traditions, robbed of their own names even, but they refused to be robbed of their faith in the one true sovereign God. And then, you know what? They'd been brought low. God lifted them up, didn't he? Nobody else was like him in the rest of the kingdom. Placed in positions of power and influence. This week's passage, guys, is just the first of several instances within the book of Daniel where we're going to see that God is sovereign and that he will remain true to people who keep their faith and trust in him. God's work within us and through us is not dependent on the current of the culture in which we find ourselves. It doesn't matter who is in charge of us here on this earth. It is not pleasant, but it doesn't matter even all the influences, you parents, that you see in the lives of your children. How many of us look at kids nowadays and you're like me, you're like, how in the world do they do it, right? It's like, it's so much worse now than it used to be. Everything is constantly in their face. Guys, they don't have to be victims of the current of the culture. God's work does not depend on that. Oftentimes, God's will is accomplished in spite of the current that we find ourselves in, the cultural current, right? In spite of that, God accomplishes his will. So what's our big takeaway? What do we take away from the message of Daniel chapter 1 today? When we find ourselves in the powerful current of today's culture, we have a choice to make, don't we? Number one, we either give ourselves over to it and just go with the flow. That's an option, isn't it? Let it take us where we don't want to go. Or two, we take a cue from Daniel and the boys, and we fight to go upstream. we go against the culture's current. We choose not to defile ourselves. We choose to honor God even in the midst of the current of an ungodly culture. And the way that happens, guys, we've got to prepare ourselves for the trip, right? We've got to prepare ourselves for what's going to happen. Strengthen ourselves in our faith so that we're able to travel upstream and to be countercultural, to be like Daniel and the boys were, and to shine and reflect the goodness of God to an unbelieving world who is looking all the time at us. Okay? How do we do that? What are the preparations? I'm a broken record, guys. Growing in our love for God. Going to God in prayer. Feeding on His Word regularly, daily. Putting it into practice. Not just hearing it, but doing what it says. And then, what else do we need to do? We've got to be, like we said last week, growing in our love, not only for God, but for each other. Growing in our love for people who are created in God's image. And we talked about what love actually looks like, biblical love. It looks like sacrifice, giving, serving, considering others more important than yourself. Living out our identity in Christ, who was the greatest servant who ever lived. If we say that we follow Him, by gosh, guys, we better be serving people. Because that's all that Jesus ever did. That is countercultural. That is transformational. That's what an unbelieving world looks at. And they're like, sign me up for some of what they got. That's what we're called to. We don't have to be victims. We don't have to just go with the flow. We can take a cue from Daniel and the boys. And again, can't wait to get into this. The first 6 chapters, so many great narratives. The last 6 chapters of the book, you'll see there's a lot of prophecies. It's called apocalyptic literature and stuff. Can't wait to go through this book with you. So some homework for you as we wrap up today. I just want you to start hanging out in the book of Daniel for the next couple months. Do it on purpose. You may be doing a reading plan already. I hope that that's the case. If you aren't and you're interested in one, I'll give you one. I've got a bunch of copies in the church office. But again, start hanging out in Daniel, reading it, praying through it, asking God, Lord, help me to learn from the courage that I see in these young men. Help me to be courageous. And then, next homework thing, again, broken record, going to bang this gong again. Answer this question. How does God want to use me within my context? Within this culture? How does God want to use me within this church family? Again, we need to be asking ourselves these kind of questions, right? Putting ourselves in a position where we're more likely to grow in love for God and for others. And that means putting ourselves in positions to serve. Again, if you're not currently doing that, we will find a place for you to serve, okay? Because it's essential for your growth as a Christian. Again, when you come to the answer to that question, how does God want to use me within my context? I'm always going to ask you, share that answer with somebody else. Why do I ask that? Anybody want, you can say. Accountability, right? How many times have I walked out after reading the Bible, or maybe I've heard some guy give a sermon, and it's like, man, the heart's burning in me. It's like, okay, I got to make some changes. I know what changes I need to make, but then I don't tell anybody. What usually happens? No change. Stuck in the current, just floating down, powerless. Again, tell someone. I will be that someone if you don't have someone. You can answer that question and tell me. And again, I'm just excited to continue the study in the book of Daniel. I want to encourage us all. Go against the current of the culture this week. It may be as simple as you're standing at the water fountain at school, students, and you hear everybody else making fun of a kid. And you know what? You know in your heart, if I join in on that, these guys will accept me. But you're countercultural. You're a nonconformist. You're being like Daniel, and you say, no, I'm not going to just go with the flow. I'm going to stand up for the image of God in this person. I'm not going to join in that. I'm going to go to that person and ask them if they want to be my friend. Again, guys, there are lots of chances for us to do this. Try to take it. Try to go countercultural. Try to go against the stream this week and just see what God will do as a result of that faith.